Sometimes being a researcher, a writer of, in my case, Irish history, American history, can be frustrating. You generally spend far more money on visiting archives than you're ever going to earn in royalties. Your hourly rate of pay probably works out at about 10% of the minimum wage, not 10% of the average industrial wage. Weirdly, my own biggest resentment revolves around 3 months spent in the National Library in my limited spare time from a daily radio programme on RTE, going through the parliamentary contributions of this gentleman here, and I use the term gentleman very loosely, in rather large physical volumes of Hansard. They were about that thick. This is one of Ireland's most illustrious villains and charlatans, William O'Shea, nemesis of Charles Stewart Parnell in the O'Shea divorce, and I was working on an anti-hagiography of the wretched man. And it was at the dawn of digitisation, and it's always galled me that a year after the book came out, every single one of the debates in which he participated was available online, right? 3 months' work could now be done in 3 days, which is my oblique way of saying that we don't have any excuses today. I could have come up with 101 reasons not to traipse into the National Library and spend my leisure hours in the company of a rogue who was not worthy of trimming the beard of the political giant that he brought to earth in the tawdry divorce case of 1890. But today, there's now so much unmediated and uncurated material available online that we have no excuse for not re-examining, refashioning, revising our social history, our local history, our community history, our economic history, in a word, our entire heritage. We live in fortunate times if you're someone who's interested in finding things out. Arguably, we live in overwhelming times, as when it comes to things like political discourse, there's far more information available than anyone would want or anyone can cope with. The phrase information overload says it all. But if we're more concerned with the past than the present or the future, we're blessed. I don't need to tell any of you, so I won't bore you with a litany of how much we can now access from our couch, from our living room, from our kitchen, without trips to the National Library or the National Archives. We've got the 1901 census, 1911 census, Griffith's valuation, Bureau of Military History witness statements, military service pensions collection, Atlantic shipping records, Dole and House of Commons debates, archive.org. You can get pretty much any book that you want. You can maybe only borrow it for an hour at a time, but you can get it. World War I military records, transatlantic shipping records, all available online. I said I wouldn't give you a litany. I did. Sorry about that. But the good news is I could have gone on much longer with that litany. I don't need to tell you that digitisation has been an absolute game changer. An illustration from my own point of view. 1921, Head of Zeus / Apollo in London, which is now a subsidiary of Bloomsbury, published a moderately successful volume of mine entitled Four Killings. It's about the War of Independence, and it's about the involvement therein of members of my extended family. But it was also a book about land, and it was a book about the possession of land and the illicit seizure of land during the early 1920s, during the War of Independence in particular. This and my long-running fascination with the American West was why I actually began the book in Arizona in 1915. So the first 2 chapters, the first killing takes place not in Ireland but in Arizona. And it was the murder of a distant cousin of mine, Jack Clinton, a homesteader and farmer, by 2 hired hands working for a huge California-based land company. The Kern County Cattle Company didn't like smallholders interfering in what they saw as their God-given right to graze their cattle over what had been free federal land, but had now been parcelled out to smallholders, or homesteaders as they were known in the USA. It's straight out of Oklahoma, straight out of the Oklahoma song, The Farmer and the Cowman Should Be Friends, with the emphasis on the should, because there was little or no chance that that was actually going to happen. So I started work on the book in 2019 and wrote both the opening Arizona chapters while living in Ireland. Having access to US newspapers online, to shipping manifests, to the US Census records, enabled me to do that. Now, granted, in some cases I had to pay for this information to websites like Ancestry.com, but as a cute whore who spent the first 6 years of my life in County Cavan, my native thriftiness ensured that my subscription was only for a month, and I did all the relevant downloading and research within those parameters. I then spent the second half of 2019 living in Berkeley, California, where my beloved was a visiting scholar in the School of English, and I secured access to the stacks below the main UC Berkeley Humanities Library. That's the Doe Library there, and availed of the Wi-Fi in the University of California, Berkeley, to then research and write the Irish chapters of the book, 6 of them in all, in a first draft. So, in a very Irish phrase, I did everything arseways. And I even toyed with the idea of making that the title of this paper before my 12-year-old daughter brought me to my senses. The point being that during 2 previous sojourns in Berkeley, this was our 3rd time living there, 2007, 2011, I wouldn't have been in a position to write those 6 Irish chapters. Had things not changed radically, I would have been obliged to mark time, to run on the spot for that period of time before I could begin the process of writing the second 3/4 of the book. 4 Killings would at best have come out in the second half of 2021, possibly 2022, at which point I'd already moved on. I was tapping into the good old interweb again to write my most recent book, which Ronan already plugged. Don't worry, I'll be giving it a few more plugs as well. Land is All That Matters, the struggle that shaped Irish history, which in turn wouldn't be coming out 2 weeks from now, might be coming out a year from now. So this is what you can do with the online resources. So we've been living through a period in Ireland where history and heritage is obviously of huge importance. During the decade of centenaries, we've got in touch with our World War I military past, with our War of Independence past, with our Civil War past. We have, as I've said, fantastic additional resources, even if we have to pay for some of them. But the question is, where do we go from here? What do we do now? How do we keep up the momentum? We've run out of anniversaries, basically, and centenaries of major significance in Ireland. In 2024, really the only game in town is the Army Mutiny, which took place around or about now 100 years ago. And it was very short-lived, so that's not going to give us an awful lot. Irish high politics and the revolutionary history, our revolutionary history, has already been subjected to rigorous analysis, particularly over the last decade, but actually for decades now. There's not much left to be said, though I'm sure that's not going to stop some people, particularly academics, from saying it anyway, all over again. So, are we going to rest on our laurels and leave all the research, us, we plebs, if you like, are we going to rest on our laurels and leave the research to the academy, to the academics, to the universities? Research that tends not to trickle down in any meaningful way. It's a bit like Vegas. What happens in academia stays in academia. It's kind of like the country and western charts. Bar a few crossover artists like Roy Foster or Dermot Ferreter, most of the academic hits remain in academia to be admired, reviled, cited or plagiarized by fellow academics. The decade of centenaries did unleash the gifted amateur historian, and that is not intended in any way as a snide, reductive or pejorative phrase. Catherine Corliss is an amateur historian, but I would argue that her work on the Tuam mother and baby home fatalities has made far more impact than the work of any so-called professional historian in the last decade. She's done fantastic work. I would argue that the work of journalists like Kevin Myers, with his frequent World War I forays in the 1980s when he wrote An Irishman's Diary, and in the 1990s, and latterly Ronan McGreevy, who is, I would argue, the de facto Irish Times history correspondent, they don't call him that, but he might as well be, have done as much or more than academic historians in keeping the study of Irish history to the forefront, as does Tommy Graham in History Ireland, magazine and through radio programmes like News Talk's long-running Talking History, with an additional shout-out there to its long-time producer, Susan Cahill, and the distinguished public historian and presenter, Patrick Quinn. He is an academic, but we'll forgive him for that. So, are we going to lose our momentum? Are the local family and community historians who use the online resources paid for out of our tax money to examine the roles of the previously unheralded in the War of Independence and the Civil War going to retire their laptops because we're out of decade of centenary runway? We've no more centenaries worth commemorating in the start of the last 10 years, so let's do a Dave Allen. Good night, thank you, and sorry, hang on. Good night, thank you. You probably don't have a clue what I'm talking about. Some of you do, yeah, okay. Good night, sorry, hang on. Even better. Yeah, good, it's water. Yeah, do you believe that? Good night, thank you, and may your God go with you. And what do you do then? Take out a Sky Sports subscription and return to the couch. Is that what's going to happen? I hope not. People like me, like Ronan McCreevy, like Kim Bielenberg of the Irish Independent, are obsessed with centenaries. Why? Because it's easier to sell an anniversary to an editor, or in my case, a producer, when it comes to making radio programmes, in my case, or writing newspaper articles in the case of somebody like Ronan. But nobody else needs to get caught up in our particular professional bind. You don't need to take an approaching date and subtract 100 in order to for work and research to be valid in that area. You don't need to have an eye right now on what happened in Ireland in 1925 or 1926 to tap in to our heritage. There's been relatively little work done on community history, relative at least to the availability now of sources for community history and the proliferation of compelling narratives from community history, stories that have yet to be told. And the same can be said of local history, social history, agrarian history, industrial history, family history. We don't need to obsess constantly about high politics that just happens to have occurred 98 or 99 years ago and will be ready for us a year or two from now, meaning that if we get cracking, we can have something ready just in time for the centenary. When it comes to high politics versus social history, remember, there have been a lot more of us than them, more ordinary Joes than icons like Collins or Griffith or De Valera, more people born to blush unseen than to rule the roost. Social history is rarely beholden to anniversaries, often for the simple reason that it's an evolutionary process. It can't be pinned down to a particular date. And, in that context, allow me to give a shout-out here to the great work of the Heritage Council in creating and expanding the Irish Community Archive Network, in addition to all the other amazing work that the Heritage Council has done over the years. Allow me a few random thoughts on where we might go next as we wave a fond goodbye to the decade of centenaries. Bye-bye, decade of centenaries, and start to fret about the future of the past. And apologies in advance if you find these notions a little bit too random. Let me point you first towards a resource that I am sure most of you are aware of, and which was highlighted by my esteemed and affable RTE colleague, John Creedon. The only thing wrong with John, of course, is he's from Cork, in his An Irish Folklore Treasury a couple of years back. Namely, it's essentially reproductions of the archive of the Irish Folklore Commission, which is now available online, where you can look at the original material. You can look at facsimiles of the original copybooks, much of it gathered in the 1930s and the 1940s by schoolchildren. In case you don't want to have to deal with dodgy handwriting, and most of it is exceptionally clear and readable, you can click on a print version of each numbered testimony. Skeptics amongst you might be wondering why I'm directing you towards a collection of material that is often of its nature ahistorical, inaccurate, dubious, rooted in prejudice and pishogue, or in a technical term that we historians use a lot about each other's work, total bullshit. I recommend it, though, for something other than entertainment, and it's highly entertaining. because of what I came to realise while writing The Land Is All That Matters. Have I mentioned, by the way, I have a book coming out? No, okay. During the 60s and 70s, work by a number of historians, many of them actually American historians, upset the apple cart of Irish agrarian history. The consensus had been of a binary contest between tenant and landlord for the land of Ireland. Expressed in its most simplistic form, this held that James I and Oliver Cromwell took it away and the Land League got it back. The landlords were shown the door by a determined effort on the part of a collectivist and united peasantry who were cruelly subjected to eviction and rack renting. The lack of nuance in this approach was exposed by thorough and objective research, and perhaps that's why so much of the best work was done by more disengaged and objective American historians, not influenced by exposure to what I love to call the Irish Christian Brothers history. It emerged from this research that, for example, eviction was relatively rare, and that post-famine, while rents did not increase, tenant income rose by 50%. And that wasn't something the very Republican priest who taught me Leaving Certificate history was imparting to his classes. That's one of the things that I deal with is in Land is All That Matters, the mythology of the land struggle, which focused on tenant-landlord relations and excluded the reality, for example, of vicious tenant-on-tenant violence. However, something else I deal with is contemporary perceptions. The tenant farmers of the 19th century did not have access to RIC statistics on farm incomes and rent levels, or the parliamentary blue books on the same subjects. They relied on perception. They relied on received wisdom, prevailing perception. In fact, on the very mythology exposed as such by the academic historians of the 60s and 70s who got to grips with the statistics, whose work has led to a very different consensus on agrarian history than those of my generation, for example, would have been taught in secondary school. I have no idea what is taught in secondary school now. I'd love to find out. Maybe I will. The fact that the odds were against any of these tenants being evicted for anything other than chronic arrears was of little consequence when the perceptions of a tenant farmer were entirely contrary. And this is where mythology plays a very distinct and significant role. This is why many of the contributions of the elderly witnesses to the folklore collections of the 1930s and 40s, memories often stretching back directly to the land war and via hearsay stretching back much further still, are perfectly valid and very, very useful, although often based on wrong-headed and inaccurate history or statistics. So, I'd love to see a sort of macaronic history. Macaronic, if you don't know what I'm talking about, this is the juxtaposition in, for example, a song or a poem of material from two languages. One is a translation of the other. So, take a local episode of agrarian history. Take the Rockites of Munster in the 1820s. Set the contents of that book there by the brilliant American historian James Donnelly Jr. It's a fantastic book. It's so thoroughly researched. Set the contents of that against references in the archive of the Folklore Commission to the Rockite conflict, and they do exist. Compare and contrast the statistical reality that Donnelly includes in his book to the stories that have been passed down. Do the same with the tithe war of the 1830s, or with the impact of the Great Famine on communities in West Cork or in Kildare or in Donegal. Offset folklore and received wisdom with the statistical reality. Do they gel? Are they mutually contradictory? Does folklore humanize the statistics? And bearing in mind that there's no such thing as inaccurate folklore, are the narratives recorded in the 1930s of times long past, are they in any sense an affront to history? In The Land is All That Matters, I refer to the folklore collection as a vital reservoir of myth as well as of oral history, in seeking to advance the importance of ideas of communal perception and collective memory over statistical reality. Now, I really should have said alongside statistical reality rather than over, so remind me to change that for the paperback edition. Okay, I'm going to skip on past a few of these because I don't want to take up too much of your time. So just let me move on to another suggestion, another major beef of mine, the odd lack of interest among Irish historians, academic and amateur, in the diaspora. In the case of, for example, Irish emigration to the USA, while academic historians are taking an increasing interest in Irish America, that's not reflected in how our history is taught in schools, albeit I attended secondary school roughly 1,000 years ago. I never learned, for example, about the numbers of Irish-born soldiers who fought in the American Civil War, upwards of 100,000, or the influence of Irish Americans and Irish-born on the 19th century politics of American cities like New York, Boston, or San Francisco. If I were to ask you, for example, which European country had provided the most professional players to US Major League Baseball, which European country? You might be surprised to discover that the answer is Ireland, with 52, well ahead of the UK, well ahead of Germany, countries with multiples of the Irish population. And they all came from somewhere in Ireland. At the moment, no one knows much about them. And of course, the baseball players are outnumbered by the huge contingent of Irish-born American professional boxers and athletes, particularly field athletes. And that's just in the area of sport. So, if you're somebody who's interested in local history, think about the diaspora. Think about somebody who came from your area and ended up playing professional baseball, either success. I mean, some of these characters they're hilarious. Some of them are really nasty. One of them, actually, a guy called Doyle from Cavan. His nickname was Nasty, because he used to pick fights with people in the crowd, with his own team, with the opposition, and with people in the crowd. Somebody like that is worth checking out. So why don't we take the time, now that we have no more cool centenaries to celebrate, to tap in to the Irish diaspora? Every townland in Ireland has some interesting connection with the history of the USA, Britain, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, even Argentina. They don't, like Ballyporeen in Tipperary or Moneygall in County Offaly, need to have produced future US presidents. And they don't all have to be admirable, upstanding citizens either. They can be anyone from Charles Thomson, the Derry-born secretary to the US Continental Congress and signatory of the Declaration of Independence, to the antecedents of the infamous Whitey Bulger, one of America's most wanted criminals, or the infamous Billy the Kid, born in New York of Irish parentage. So let me I'll just do one example. I was going to do two, but I'm conscious of time. I'm going to give one example from a small town close to my own hometown of Kells. That's Oldcastle in County Meath. Population 1,400. And it has a very interesting connection and it's now conscious of it, to the US Civil War and to an Irish journalist that I'm sure none of you have ever heard of, called Charles Graham Halpin. One of the great Irish characters of the American Civil War came from the town of Oldcastle. Private Miles O'Reilly of the 47th New York Regiment, twice a sergeant and twice reduced to the ranks for unknown acts of insubordination, generally involving drink and violence. In reality, however, he was entirely fictional. He was created by a genuine Oldcastle man, journalist and soldier Charles Graham Halpin. But to the troops, to Union soldiers, especially Irish-American Union soldiers, he was very real. He was one of them. He was as real as Ulysses Grant. Halpin himself was born in Oldcastle, And he was the son of the local Church of Ireland curate. And the death of his father in 1850, in impecunious circumstances, forced him to opt for journalism, to abandon doing a degree in Trinity and to opt for journalism as a profession. He emigrated to the States in 1851. He worked for the New York Herald, owned by James Gordon Bennett, and he later moved to the New York Times. This is Myles O'Reilly. There was actually I beg your pardon. This is a story relating to Halpin, which I will skip over. During the Civil War, Halpin was given the rank of major, and by the end of the war, he had twice been cited for gallantry. In 1862, his alter ego, Myles O'Reilly, was born, and in pidgin Hiberno English, Myles commented on the Civil War in bogus letters to New York newspapers, generally speaking, given out about bad leadership and bad Union generals. And he became a huge favourite with the troops. He was the kind of Ross O'Carroll Kelly of his day, minus all the stupid rugby stuff. Okay, Halpin goes as far as actually having him visit the White House and chatting with Abraham Lincoln, because Halpin himself was somebody who met Lincoln on a regular basis. What's really, really interesting about Halpin and Myles O'Reilly is he became very influential because of his support for emancipation of slaves. And that changed a lot of Irish-American minds in the ranks of the Union Army. So he had a tremendous influence. And the reason I mention this story is because of that. That's the Protestant church in Oldcastle, and that is a lovely marble seat which was installed about 10 years ago, with a bit of a nudge from me via a talk on Halpin in Oldcastle in 2012, in the church where his father was rector. Some Oldcastle community activists did a bit more research of their own and then worked towards and collected money for the erection of a memorial to Halpin. And a few years ago, I was delighted to be invited back to Oldcastle to take part in the unveiling of this inscribed marble seat outside of the Church of Ireland church in the middle of the town. Okay, I was going to talk about these guys, the Moore brothers, silent and early talky movie stars, three brothers from Fordstown in County Meath. I won't, because I'm going to move on. One of them was married to Mary Pickford before she met Douglas Fairbanks, and that was the end of that. But my point with this is Fordstown. I don't know if anybody knows Fordstown. It's absolutely tiny. It's a blink. If you blink when you're driving through it, you'll miss it. Yes, it can boast these three. These guys were absolute superstars. Between them, they made 500 movies. So what I'm saying is that, in the localities that you come from, you could have somebody like the Moores, you could have somebody like Charles Graham Halpin. So what I'm saying is think diaspora. If you're looking for something to do, something to commemorate. These are just some of the movies they were involved in. So I'm going to finish by projecting forward. I have a prediction about the most popular area of future research among non-professional historians. And we've touched on this over the last two series of the History Show on RTE Radio. In late 2023, we did a programme on the last great hidden social history treasure trove, which is the Irish Land Commission archive. The Land Commission itself dates back to the 1881 Land Act and became highly visible in the decades after independence, when it was responsible for the redistribution of farmland. The Commission itself ceased to function in 1999, but the material in the archive, much of which is unknown and uncatalogued, often goes back well before 1881, in some cases to the 16th and 17th centuries. And our 2023 programme highlighted the fact that access to the archive was severely limited. It was virtually non-existent. The genealogist, Fiona Fitzsimons, who has actually done family trees for Obama and Joe Biden, was denied access to the Land Commission archive when she was compiling a family tree for then US Vice President Joe Biden. So a few weeks ago, we did a follow-up programme that involved a tour of the facility in Portlaoise by yours truly. I was afraid they were going to poison the coffee after the programme before Christmas, but fair dues and they didn't. And it included the good news that the Department of Agriculture is currently in negotiation with the National Archives to hand over much of the material in the Portlaoise archive and another facility in Sandyford. And the archive contains something like 11 million documents. This is something that they found completely by accident when they were searching files on behalf of a solicitor who was involved in conveying land. Maps, deeds, correspondence, reports by Land Commission inspectors, contains all of that. It contains much of the social history of rural Ireland. And the prospect of digitising the collection, I'd say non-existent to remote at best, because it's so vast. The cost would be absolutely prohibitive. In addition to which, the focus of the National Archive at the moment, I would imagine, when it comes to digitisation, is probably the 1926 census, which we can look forward to in a couple of years. However, digitising the Land Commission Archive Index and putting that online is a practical project and would be invaluable. I mentioned the major re-evaluation of the history of the land struggle in the 1970s. Who knows? That consensus may be about to be scuttled by increased research access to the Land Commission Archive. I'm hoping, my fingers are crossed, my legs are crossed, every part of my anatomy is crossed, that something will actually come of this and that we will actually be able to get access to this absolute. It's a vast archive. It's in a what looks like a factory building in an industrial estate in Portlaoise.